This episode is brought to you in part by Museum of the Bible and its new worship experience, All Creation Sings, made in partnership with Creator. Step into an immersive room with vibrant visuals, soundscapes of praise, and interactive displays illuminating the story of worship. Get tickets at museumofthebible.org/ACS.
Welcome to the Grace Enough podcast. I am your host, Amber Cullum. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with my friend, Jodi Grubbs. Jodi is the author of Live Slowly, an invitation to exhale. Growing up on an island, Jodi was intimately familiar with a slower pace. But it wasn't until she faced a life-altering event that she felt called to return to those roots. In our conversation, Jodi shares about her childhood on the island, the pivotal moments that led her back to island time, and the profound impact of integrating forced pauses into her spiritual practices. We also dive into the challenges and blessings of intentionally slowing down and finding sanctuary in the midst of a busy world. Whether you're feeling overwhelmed by the pace of life or simply curious about the slow living movement, Jodi's insights are sure to inspire and encourage you. If you find this conversation encouraging or helpful, will you please share it with a friend or on social media? As I've said before, your sharing is one of the best ways to support the podcast. So thank you for every share and every comment. Jodi Grubbs, welcome to the Grace Enough podcast.
Thank you, Amber. I'm so glad to be here with you today.
It's so fun when I get to sit down with people I know in person, and everyone listening is saying she says that so often. We are tired of it, but that's okay. I'm happy anyways.
Yeah, it's true.
It is. Well, today we are going to talk a little bit about your story and also just the book that you're getting ready to release in the world, which I will share the title to in a bit. But I want you to take us back to your childhood of growing up on an island. Like, what was life like for you? The pace, the friendships, family life, your walk with Christ, just a little bit of a brief overview of all of those things.
Yeah, so I was born on the island of Bonaire. It's an island in the Dutch Caribbean in the Netherlands Antilles, so about 50 miles north of Venezuela. And I lived there from 72 to 88, so all my
Wow.
formative years. I was in a Dutch public school since I was 4, so all my schooling was in Dutch. We spoke English at home, and I had a lot of island friends, a few American friends, but mostly island friends. The pace was slow. We call it poco poco, which
I love
means
it.
slow. So I joke with people that that's where this whole slow living started for me, was my childhood home, the island. So people were very gracious. It was more of a rhythm of slowness, not like a
Planned.
particularly planned thing. It's just the way life is. It's beautiful there, crystal clear waters and more cactus than palm trees on our particular island. But just the way of life was refreshing and day to day with your people.
Yeah. So why were your parents there?
So my dad was the director of finance for TWR. Transworld Radio is one of the largest international media companies in the world. And at that time, they got assigned to the island of Bonaire. So I was born a year later, and here we are.
Wow. I love that you talk a little bit about island time because just this week, I said that to my oldest son because we're going to visit St. John for vacation. And everybody talks about island time. And he's like, what's that? And I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure everybody's just a lot like slower pace than we are, which he can't quite wrap his mind around. But I'm like, I can't wait for it. So I'm getting ready to
Yeah,
find out about island time.
you'll love it. And you might not notice there is a slower pace, but also it's just sort of the way of life. So make advantage of that. If you talk to people and look them in the eye, try the food, like, all these different things that make up slower living just kind of comes a little more natural down there.
Yeah. So, at what point in your life did you decide to follow Christ? Like, what does your early faith journey look like?
So I had a time when I was a little girl around 4 that I asked Christ into my heart. That was the language that we used.
Yeah.
And so whether I, knew exactly what I was saying or not, I feel like I can say I've had God. I've been walking with God for a really, really long time. There's been ups and downs through that for sure.
Mhm.
There's been awakenings. There's been God calling me back closer to Him. But I would say it started when I was a little girl, and then I also did something a little bit different. I got baptized at 10 in the ocean instead of
I love
in
it.
a church.
Yeah, I love that. Well, it's funny because it really is about where you're raised because I mean in Florida, we watched a ton of friends get baptized in the ocean. I mean,
Oh, good.
that's where both my nephews were baptized. But then growing up in Kentucky, I mean, I watched people get baptized in the creek.
Oh, wow. I love
I
that.
know. Now there were baptismals too. It sometimes just depended upon like what your church did or if they had the resources or if they didn't or if they just chose to do something different. So it's kind of unique.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me this, as a young adult, you experienced a life-altering event. Share as much or as little of that as you feel comfortable sharing. And talk about, like, during that time, the realization that God was calling you really back into some of this quote unquote island time living.
I call this long season that happened to me in my mid 20s, when slowing down is chosen for you.
Mm.
So I was married at the time to Brian, and he was in a life altering accident. He lived, and he should not have lived through that. And when that happens, there's just a lot of aftermath. So almost 2 million in medical bills, 33 surgeries in 2.5 years. He made an almost full recovery, and then he passed away just with me at home. His aorta burst and he died. So needless to say, that was like a double whammy for me. So we had to slow our whole life down when the accident happened, and then I was forced to pause again and pivot when he died unexpectedly.
Yeah. Oh my
As far
gosh.
as, that pace and God calling me back to island time, I'm thankful that I sort of had it in my blood, that
Mm.
I understood a little bit more about that. It took me years to understand that sometimes what we see as suffering, it might actually be a gift of slowing down. So many people go through it and we don't know how to name it.
Mm.
But I would say during that time, God called me back to just um, slow down to feel things that I didn't
Oh
want to
wow.
feel. A lot of times we joke that we don't want to slow down because of FOMO, fear of missing out. That
Mhm.
is a big and valid one, even for me as a slow living advocate. But the really deeper one is that we just don't want to slow down to have to talk and sit with God in the really hard things. And so I think him calling me back to island time during that time was setting me up for these next 25 years of my life.
Wow, girl. It is interesting how often the things we experience that are really, really hard, those life altering events, really do set you, I mean, on a path that like you never would have necessarily chosen for yourself, but you find yourself sometime down the line almost in your words advocating for. And so when you think about these forced pauses, and that is something that you talk about in, oh my goodness, I almost just said slow live. Wait, living, living slow. Wait, which one is it, Jody?
It's live slowly. I had to do the same thing, Amber, because it's several years in the making of this title. So
Well, and you and I have had so many conversations about this. I'm like, wait, living slow, slow living, an invitation to exhale. That part I have down very well. But so when you think about these forced pauses, um, talk about those a little bit in the sense of what you share in the book and, maybe just some of the rhythms that they end up developing in people that actually can be really healthy.
This episode is brought to you in part by Beyond Ordinary Women Ministries, which prepares Christian women for leadership. At BOW, we believe that every woman is a leader because she influences someone. So, whom do you influence? Do you mentor a woman? Serve in the workplace? Or do you lead a small group, teach the Bible, or even lead an entire ministry? No matter who or how many you influence, our free online resources will help equip you. Our videos, podcast episodes, and articles from experienced women leaders will encourage you and perfect your leadership skills. They offer wisdom for dealing with ministry pitfalls, current biblical issues, health for your own soul, and insights for shepherding others well. In addition, BOW offers Bible studies designed to connect women of multiple generations. They provide a challenge to both women new to the Bible and those wanting to dig deeper. Be our guest and browse all of our free resources and low-cost Bible studies at beyondordinarywomen.org.
Yeah, so just one little story of the pause. So during this time that Brian was in the hospital for 9 months, I was bit by a brown recluse spider. And so of course, it's like, Lord, what in the world? You always hear about these people, they just have all this drama, and you're thinking, what in the world? Well, that happened to me during that time. And yeah, so he knocked me out for 3 days. No,
My
the
gosh.
doctors knocked me out for 3 days in the hospital, but my body needed the rest so bad. Um, that's just a little story of a forced pause, but the spiritual practices that come from that. So one is acceptance. We just have to come to a point where we say, okay, I can't fight this anymore. I don't have the control I thought I had. And it's just this open hands where, okay, Lord, I just accept it. The other thing is presence. You have to accept the presence of other people. You have to be present with other people. Sometimes it's easier to not, but part of slowing down is really seeing and hearing each other. So it's kind of important to just let yourself go there. It is really healing in those times. Another practice that's one of my favorite is just lingering. Lingering, whether that's with a friend over coffee and you really hear each other and see each other, give space for each other, or if it's lingering with God in the loneliness of that forced pause, that season. When I had to go to doctor appointments for my spider bite my foot and have others help me, some of those times were lonely. It wasn't a real long period of time, but it sure put a dent in my plans of work and then visiting Brian and then, all the things I felt like I was responsible for.
Wow. As I'm listening to you share that, it reminds me of literally in just the last couple of weeks, a very close family member who is very young experienced a heart attack and had a bypass surgery. And we're not talking about like a parent, this is someone really young. And the phone calls that I received to talk about like what they needed to receive the help, how hard it was for them to let people in. And I was really pressing back into that and saying, let people help you. They want to provide meals for you. They want to financially give to you because for some people, that's the only way they know how to give. It's not just because they feel sorry for you. And some of those forced pauses were long car trips back and forth to the hospital where she felt lonely. And so
Oh,
it's so true what you're saying.
it's just a time where I feel like God is saying, here are your people. Like, this is not what you were expecting. This stopped everything, your normal rhythm of your work and your life and school. But you have an opportunity to accept love from people. And what I learned was that kindness also reflected who God was.
Mm.
And so I think that's the beautiful thing to not miss is I got to see like almost the face of God through a lot of different people.
Mm. So when you think about that, I know sometimes pushback is not the right word, but sometimes what people can miss is God in those moments because they're not necessarily something sorry, I should not use my critical, sassy voice that we see in the Bible labeled as lingering or presence, although we see it all throughout scripture. But because some people need the label, my question to you would be, how is it in those moments that you felt like you were able to mix what some would call the sacred and secular so that I don't keep God on one side of my life and the rest of my life in a different box, or the only time God is present is if he has specifically answered a prayer or I read about it specifically in the word?
Yeah, I think for me to wrap my head around that type of slow living theology is to remember, all the times that I think of Jesus lingering, you know,
Mm,
he made breakfast on the beach for his friends, a fish fry in the morning, over the fire.
yeah.
He sat and talked for a long time with the woman at the well. We
And
know
the
that he was
children.
and the children that had to come to him and he had to sit still. I think presence and lingering, we see it all throughout the Bible if we're willing to look at it as part of their ordinary life and part of our ordinary life.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just even contextually, the pace of the Hebrew people is much more of a slower, like, enjoy meals together, take the time to do more than just shove things down your face and then move along, right?
Yeah, I think someone said the other day I was reading, so I don't have the number, but there are so many mentions of feasts in the
Mhm,
Bible.
mhm.
We know that that was important. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me this, what have been for you personally some of the challenges of pressing into this intentional slow living when the reality is we don't live in a culture that is slow in any sense of the word. Our culture is pedal to the metal all the time, high stress levels, all the things.
Yeah. Well, part of it is my personality. I'm an introvert. I go a little bit slower. I've had some health challenges over the years. I have what I lovingly call my fake knee, my knee replacement. So there's been reasons why I haven't been able to move as fast.
Mm,
So to be fair, I don't know if some of these things didn't happen to me. I don't know how fast or slow I'd be going today, right?
mm,
Because this is our culture. So a challenge I had was when my daughter was 5 and 6, we decided to homeschool, and there were so many opportunities to do things that we just kind of ran the roads. We'll go to this field trip and we'll go to that event and this museum. And I didn't want to miss out. And
mm.
what happened was I started getting sick. My body started breaking down. I would get pneumonia, bronchitis. My adrenals started kind of failing where I just had to slow down. And so the challenges are there. Like we have to use them and kind of flip them around to say, okay, what's the best use of this time? I think a
Mm,
mindset also, living on an island, I had a different mindset. So I was able to keep pulling that in over the years and say, wait a minute, Jodi, you know what it's like to live slower. The rest of the world doesn't live like this. So I've
yeah.
had to sort of pull myself out and say, okay, I'm going to need to be different. I'm going to need to be intentional about this. And
Mm.
if I don't, things start to fall apart with people around me or my health, because that's just what happens. We become disconnected to ourselves and each other.
When I hear you say that, I wonder if some of the pushback from people would be, okay, well, what about when we don't have these forced pauses as often, yet we're desperate to slow down and it's hard to know even where to begin. And I know that you write some things in the book about, you know, practices you can begin to cultivate intentionally um, in order
Mhm.
to slow yourself down a little bit. And so, can you speak to some of those? Like someone who, okay, well, I know I have a high stress level, but there's just nothing I can do about it because all this stuff has to get done. What would you say to them?
Yeah, to that person, what I say is I have watched friends who either have high capacity or are extroverts go, 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 which is great. They're made to do that. But what I've noticed is when they don't pause to refuel themselves so they
Mhm.
can go, 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 it affects mostly their relationships.
Mm,
People kind of get gypped. They get, oh, I'm so busy. Sorry, I forgot to, make it to whatever. And so the relationships start getting damaged and the person doesn't realize it because they're just running in so many directions. I think that's the saddest thing for me when I watch this happen. I think that, we have to have boundaries, especially in faith settings. That's a big one that I talk about in the book is um, we have to be able to say no. So, for example, if you have, say, a young single mom, she has no choice but to say no and put boundaries up.
that's
She
right.
already has to take her kids to school herself. She has to work full time. She has to try and make healthy meals. There's no way she can say yes to everything. And she knows she can't because she needs that 7 hours of sleep so she can do it again the next day.
Mhm.
So, I look at people who are doing this already because they have to,
Mm,
and I say, "Okay, well, if they can do it, I think we can too." Because she can't
mhm.
afford to get burned out. She can't afford to be pulled in so many directions. She has to be there for her children and for her own health.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I see that. And it's interesting that you bring up the relationship piece because even again, I've put something else on my plate that I'm like, I'm loving it, but something else because I love that, then I need to take something else off because I said to my son this week, I was like, you know what? I really miss your dad. We just really haven't been chatting much lately because everybody's going 600 miles an hour. And so that's a good word for me for sure. So then speaking to that, continuing a little bit in that same vein, what are some of the practical shifts that your book offers for us to make towards slow living? Like what are just a few of the practical things? Like you said, saying no. Like you got to start practicing saying no sometimes and just feel the FOMO and realize that the next
Yeah.
morning you really didn't miss out on
Yeah,
that much. That's one. Any other just practical shifts we can
right.
make?
Well, one that I love is awakening to beauty. We had such a chance during the pandemic to see quiet and still and growth. Like if you went for a walk in the park, 3 months into the pandemic, that place was going to look a lot different than before.
Mhm.
More animals, more foliage. And so I think watching, keeping an eye out for it, like, I've often had to just pause in a parking lot before going in the grocery store at 5:30 during golden hour and say, "Look
Mm.
up, Jody.
Yeah.
Look at the orange and the pinks. How could you miss that?" So that's just a little practical way of slowing down. It reorients your heart, I think, towards your
Mhm.
creator. And it puts you in this place where you're like, "Oh yeah, that's right. I have 10 things to do." But, it's that but I can afford to slow down for a minute. Embracing your uniqueness is another one that I love to talk about. We all have little quirks, or we all have things that are, whether they're labeled in our society or not. For me, one is HSP. I'm a highly sensitive person. So being okay with that, being okay with, hey, if I can't go to a concert with you because it is just super loud and it's going to kind of give me a little bit of a headache or my nervous system is rattled, and be okay with saying that's all right. I'm going to go walk in a
Yes.
museum instead this weekend. So
Mm.
really listening to your own body and what it's trying to tell you about slowing down.
Yeah, I really appreciate that and feel like that's something that I could even speak into the youth that I teach on a regular basis because I feel like that's a time in your life where you so desperately want to be like your peers. Not that that ever fully goes away, but you learn how to appreciate your uniqueness so much more as you get older. But man, in those middle and high years, they're just like, I don't want to be different.
Yeah.
You know? So, really fostering that celebration of what makes you unique and then doing that for others is so important.
It is. You're right, Amber, because there's so many people who they just want to be seen and heard. That's like a theme probably, that you've heard just with podcasting and your guests. And so I think slowing down to pay attention to ourselves and others and just that prompting from God is a huge way to love God and love others, really.
Mm, so sweet and so needed. And it does just take intentionality, right? Like I know when I first started regularly practicing gratitude, it went from, oh, I'm just going to write things down in a journal because I need to do something to like now, 10 years into that, it's really paying attention to beauty. Really. I mean, that's what so much of gratitude to God is. And it's just a daily
Yeah.
rhythm of my life, not to write it down, but just to speak it all the time.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. A decade.
I know. Don't worry, it doesn't take everybody that long. So, right. Like, don't get freaked out by the 10 years that it takes, but no. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. Finding sanctuary and caring for your soul. So, the reality is, some of the practices that you have mentioned are caring for your soul. But when we talk about our walk with Christ and finding sanctuary in that when it comes to slow living, are there specific practices, or should I say rituals, or just what would you say about that?
I kind of break it into two parts. There's one part that is just all in our mind, where if you're in a busy city and you want to find sanctuary, it might be a small bench in a rose garden that's
Yes.
just right in the middle of New York City, to be honest. Because there's beauty to be found and there's solitude. And then other things are finding sanctuary. I just call it like your island in the city. Where's that soul care sanctuary, that safe place just for you and God? It might be an old chair in your bedroom by a window. It might be your front porch.
Mm,
And sometimes it's a place you were at, maybe when you were younger, you were sitting by some waterfalls on a family trip. And you might need to just go on, your front porch and sit and close your eyes and pretend you're back there again and just talk
mhm.
to God. That's that practice of finding sanctuary for your soul. Is it just a place that is so special for you just to sit and talk with God?
Yeah, and have you found, like, I guess even in just the writing of this book and, some of the studies that you have done, and please feel free to be like, "No, I have no idea." The way that our brains really connect to our body and for us to Christ when we visit those places, like those physical places, what that kinda does to our soul. Have you looked into any of that?
I have read a little bit about it. I know that there's some people that are probably way more familiar with that. Maybe Andy Colbert is a good one for
Yes.
sure. I've learned a lot from her. I think that our bodies know better than us. So when you do something like you're sitting in a beach chair at the lake or, at the ocean, and you say, "Oh, it's just so relaxing." It's like, yes, because when our minds can quiet down, we feel the water, we hear the rhythm of the waves, something in our body is just crying out for that. And I
Mm.
think that we know it's helpful. I don't have any like big data.
Yeah, yeah.
I've been reading and hearing about it for so long. I sort of just incorporated it into my life. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I know like from the EMDR therapy that I have done, like one of our practices is I really needed to be able to take my mind to the safe place for me. And that was an actual physical place, but obviously during a therapy session, I had to be able to bring that up in my mind. And, part of it was because it does just bring you back to a sense of safety. And what I love about finding sanctuary too is just knowing that, like, we have the Holy Spirit that lives inside of us. And sometimes when I can't get my brain to some of those places of peace and relaxation, like I can even focus in on that. And that provides such safety and sanctuary for me. But the visual with that knowledge does definitely, I mean, it calms your blood pressure, takes your heart rate down, it does all the things. And, that's how God designed us, which is incredible.
Yes, and that reminds me when you say that, they have done a lot of scientific study with that, with breath prayers,
Yes.
how that happens, so absolutely.
That's really,
Yeah.
really cool. So, I want you, as we close out here, to share a little bit about. I mean, I know personally that this book has been in the making for a long time. It's been your heart, it's been your soul for quite a while. So, will you share with our listeners here just a little bit of your journey of writing this? You kind of have already. So I hope the question makes sense when I ask it. I want to hear from you from a personal perspective.
Sure. Yeah. In 2017, I joined a writers community. I knew I wanted to write, share, all those things. I didn't know exactly what that would look like, but I knew that I wanted to share ideas about slow living with people. It's funny because it's taken me that long just to get it where
Yeah.
it is today. These things are a long time in the making, but I've had to put things on hold so much, and then when I look back, I'm like, "Oh, I'm so glad I did because I keep learning things, Amber." So, there's
Yay.
things in the yeah, there's things I wrote in 2018, but there's also things in the book that God showed me just a week or 2 before my edits were due.
Wow.
So, yeah, it's sort of like, I feel like this is my life book. Like, I start from, I'm born on the island, and then just until recently, even an EMDR experience I had that God used. So I don't know if that answers your question in a roundabout way, but
Yes, it does.
yeah.
I mean, I think sometimes because I talk so much to authors and about books on here, I think it's easy for people to think that it's not a process and that people just sit down and write a book and then it's like out in the world. And I don't know, when I talk to my actual personal friends who I know a little of their journey, I want listeners to know that it's very, very personal and it's hard fought for, and it's deeply rooted inside the person who puts this book baby out in the world. And so I'm happy for you.
Yeah, thank you. It's so vulnerable
Yeah.
because I've had to live everything in this book. And, you know, we're taught as writers, like, well, you write for yourself first and then the reader. And that's 100% true. And I'm finding that now.
Mm. Well, Jodi, if people want to read the book, I mean, obviously they can get it all the places, but if they also just want to connect to resources that you have available, where can they do that?
Yeah, if you go to my website, jodigrubbs.com, I am starting a resource page. There's a few up there already, some of my favorite authors who have shaped me, and then starting to just add little resources here and there that you can go to. There are also a lot of resources in the book.
Thank you so much, Jodi, for being here today. I appreciate you and hopefully look forward to seeing you soon.
Yes, thank you, Amber. I'm excited that I've been a guest on here, but I'm even more excited that we're friends in real life locally.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Grace Enough podcast. I hope my conversation with Jodi has inspired you to consider the pace of your own life and the ways in which you can incorporate slow living principles. Jodi's journey reminds us that slowing down is not just about reducing activity, but about creating space for what truly matters: connection with God, connection with others, and connection with ourselves. If you found today's episode helpful, please follow the Grace Enough podcast and leave a review. Your feedback helps me reach more people with stories of faith and grace. And don't forget to check out Jodi's book for practical tips on embracing a slower, more intentional way of living.
Thank you for listening to the Grace Enough podcast. Tune in next time.